comes out normally, I think.
If not, everything will be in reverse.
Right, but
okay,
it's the best we got. All right, so welcome everyone. Before I begin the introduction, I'm required by UT Austin's policies regarding student organizations to read the following disclaimer. Tonight's event is being hosted by the Polish Club at UT, a registered student organization. This is not an event sponsored by the University of Texas at Austin. The views expressed tonight are of the student organization / invited guest speaker and do not represent the views of the university or its officers. All right, with that said, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Eric Opiela. Mr. Opiela is a fifth-generation Texan, rancher, and attorney. He graduated with honors from UT Austin and earned his law degree from the University of Texas School of Law. After law school, Mr. Opiela clerked for the Honorable Mary Ellen Coster Williams on the United States Court of Federal Claims in Washington, D.C. He is admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas. Notably, his ancestors were some of the founders of Santa Maria, Texas, the oldest Polish settlement in the U.S., and where the Polish Club will be traveling this month.
oh good,
Yeah.
cool.
Mr. Opiela is currently the second vice president of the Polish American Council of Texas, or the PACT. In his career, Mr. Opiela serves as the president of the South Texans Property Rights Association and chairs its eminent domain and endangered species subcommittees. Moreover, Mr. Opiela is a recognized expert in Texas groundwater and property law, having represented landowners for over a decade. What is more, Mr. Opiela is a published scholar on the Texas rule of capture. Mr. Opiela is also very involved in politics. He served as the executive director of the Republican Party of Texas from 2008 to 2009 and was its associate general counsel from 2010 to 2017. Mr. Opiela was also chairman of the Karnes County Republican Party for 4 years and represented Senate District 21 on the Texas State Republican Executive Committee for 2 terms. To this end, he is also well-versed in campaign finance and election law. Mr. Opiela is also very involved in his community. He serves as founding president of the Karnes City Independent School District Education Foundation, where he raises over $250,000 annually for rural schools in Karnes County. Furthermore, Mr. Opiela is involved with his faith, serving as treasurer of the Catholic Community Foundation of the Archdiocese of San Antonio and as a trustee of the Catholic Fraternity Fund. Mr. Opiela and his wife, Laura, split time between Karnes City and Austin with their 2 children, Natalie and Ryan. Finally, Mr. Opiela is an incredibly generous donor to the Polish Club at UT, so please make sure to thank him for his contribution to our club. Before we start tonight's event, I would like to provide everyone with a brief roadmap of how the event will proceed. Mr. Opiela will speak for roughly 45 minutes about his life story and experience serving the Texas Polish community and about Texas Polonia in general. He will then take Q&A for around 10 minutes. With that said, I now welcome Mr. Opiela.
Well, thank you, Mr. Silverstein, and I hope you'll be the timekeeper for tonight, so we don't get too far afield. But excited to be here. It's been a couple of years since I've been in UTC, but it looks largely the same. I think they maybe put a coat of paint on the walls, and that's about it over the last 20 years. But tonight I'm going to talk a bit about Texas Polonia, which, interestingly, very few people in the room have a connection to in terms of the original Polish settlements in South Texas. As you can tell from the bio, I'm really excited to be a descendant from the original Polish settlers of Santa Maria, Texas, which is the oldest Polish settlement in North America, and which y'all will be going to in a couple of weeks. We have a neat center that just opened called the Polish Heritage Center at Santa Maria, which you'll have an opportunity to see. I missed the grand opening last weekend. It opened. It's been under construction since 2010. It's been a pay-as-you-go, no debt sort of, building it up from the bootstraps. And I'm really excited that this type of class 1 offering is there in the scrub brush of South Texas. So I'm going to start off, though, by showing a video about the Polish Heritage Center, just so you can get an idea of what it's like in Santa Maria. Have y'all ever seen it? Okay, so good. Let's just start off real quick. see if you can hear this, hopefully. Oh.
Polish culture is an incredibly important part of the American.
So what's the story with the video?
I need to unplug and plug it back in.
Unplug and plug, okay. We couldn't get the sound to work earlier, so. Here we go. Okay, cool.
Some of the earliest settlers were in places like
Oh, here.
in St. Hedwig here in Texas. But Santa Maria is really the Plymouth Rock, the founding place, the cradle of American culture, the first fully Polish settlement in the United States. They came to the tree there in place they named Anna Maria. In the Polish culture, one of the most beautiful celebrations is midnight mass at Christmas. As soon as it was 12 o'clock, they offered mass of Thanksgiving under that tree. And that tree still stands there today. It's a great symbol of strength through faith and trust in God. We've got to remember that they arrived here in 1854, only 18 years after the Alamo, only 9 years after Texas became a state. This was tough country. There were no roads, there were no wells, there was certainly no electricity, there were no homes, there were no buildings, there was nothing. All they brought with them was their strong faith, their know-how, and their pride in their Polish heritage and their culture, and they went to work. It took tremendous courage, and they did it. We got to honor that courage, got to respect that courage, and that's what the Heritage Center is all about.
We're so fortunate to have it here in what St. John Paul described as the nest of Polish immigration to the United States. He said they're famous in Poland.
Anna Maria w Teksasie jest sławna w Polsce.
When you walk up to the building, it is magnificent, but it's just
I was
a shell.
there when Pope John Paul
What
came
really
and
is
visited
needed
us when I
now
was
is to
9.
build that interior. Inside, we're going to have exhibits. It's going to have a theater. It's going to have a library, research and archive section, the genealogical section. It's going to have the history of the families. It is going to be one of the most talked about centers in the United States and in fact in the world.
When I first saw that building, I said, wow, I could not believe it. I could not believe that something of this scope, of this size, of this magnitude was being put up to honor our Polish ancestors. It just really grabbed me. It really grabbed me right here. And I said, my gosh, what a beautiful story this is to tell.
My name is Randy Pavelik. My family came here from Poland in the mid-1850s on a boat to Indianola, walked to Santa Maria, bought some land, and the land is really terrible where they settled. How they made a living, I'll never know. And I think that the people who inherited this land from their ancestors should really step up to the plate and make a large contribution
It's kind of a fundraiser
versus a
video.
$50 contribution, because that's all because of your ancestors that you're able to do this. And that's one of the reasons why my wife and I have given a fairly large amount, and we plan to give again. We'll probably give every year.
Albert Cerner family came in 1854, which is George's great-great-grandfather, and his father, his great-great-grandfather, Thomas Koala, came in 1856. We don't understand how they survived. They had droughts, and that almost starved them to death. They sacrificed a great deal, and their heritage needs to be preserved. The hardships, their Christianity, their family values, their sense of community, everything that they gave us, they taught us, we need to keep that preserved for future generations.
We've been greatly blessed. The whole community is blessed. That's why people need to consider the project that we've got going to preserve the heritage. When I see that building, it makes me feel like we're putting up something that's going to last 300, 400 years for future generations.
I'm Sam Guitarra. This is my wife, Susie. We're from Santa Maria, or Cornish County area. Our ancestors were the Bunks. The first year, they had probably the greatest drought in South Texas history. They had to hunker down and do the best they could with what they had.
our parents and grandparents made sacrifices so that we can all have what we have, and we should share that and pay it forward. The older generation is passing on and the stories aren't being told. We need to keep these stories for our children and grandchildren.
We are Lambert and Rosalie Pawelek-Kiesman. Our great-grandparents came from Poland. We gave because we felt like they need to be rewarded and remembered for what they did.
I think we should give to this thing, and I think everyone should look at it and say, hey, this wasn't just handed to us, it was your parents and your great-grandparents who worked for it. Support them today, and let's leave something in their honor.
This campaign is not finished. We need people to contribute. We have raised $7.3 million. That has provided us the land. It has provided us the shell. But what still needs to happen is we need to raise the funds to provide that.
And now it's open, so y'all get to see the benefit of it.
In Oregon, we met less others. And I invite all of you to do what you can and not just a one-time gift, but continue to give.
Let me fast forward through it a little bit. But I wanted to, it's a good like overview of kind of how the community started, okay? In 1854, Christmas Eve of 1854, 100 families came to Panna Maria and arrived on a ship. They spent over 2.5 weeks on a ship. They had come because in the spring of 1854, these were all a bunch of farmers from Upper Silesia. And they had a flood that took all the crops. And so they had nothing, to speak of. And Father Leopold Muchagamba was a Franciscan priest who had been assigned to be the pastor of the German-speaking communities here in Central Texas. Y'all might be familiar with New Braunfels, might be familiar with Fredericksburg, with Casterville. He rode the circuit on horseback in the early 1850s because they sent him here because he spoke German. The Silesia is the borderland between Germany and Poland. About 50% of the people that live in Silesia are German speaking, about 50% are Polish. In fact, during the interwar period, there was a plebiscite, there was a vote on whether they wanted to join Poland or join Germany. And it was a close vote. So it kind of gives you an idea of how that's really the cultural melting pot of Central Europe, where the Czechs, the Poles, and the Germans come together. And all three of those groups came here to Texas in the 1800s. The Germans were first, and frankly, they're better at marketing than the Poles. And so they had a great community and just a great kind of Central Texas hill country experience. And Father Leopold wrote back in letters home and said, Texas is the land flowing with milk and honey. And when reality, what it was the land of rattlesnakes and prickly pear cactus. And he encouraged all of these 100 families, his neighbors, his family members, to come here. And so they did. My ancestors on my mother's side, on my father's side came. And then the German-speaking peoples came later on my mother's side as well. And so I'm the product of all of these groups that came here to Central Texas and South Texas in the mid-1800s. They marched overland from Indianola, which no longer exists. It was the second largest port on the Gulf of Mexico. It was destroyed in a hurricane in the 1870s. They walked overland all the way to San Antonio and then met up with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Tobin, who had given land to the Archdiocese of San Antonio to help immigrant communities. And so they marched down to the confluence of the San Antonio River and the Cibolo Creek, about 100 miles due south of Austin, and made it there on Christmas Eve of 1854. And like was said in the video, celebrated midnight mass that night with nothing. They had dug holes in the ground in the middle of the winter to stay warm at night. And in fact, that winter of 1855 ended up being the coldest winter on record in the 19th century here in South Texas. And then, of course, like was said in the video, they had a drought the next year. And so they had nothing to be able to survive upon. There was a gentleman by the name of Andreas Coy, a Spanish, not really immigrant because the border crossed him in terms of the establishment of Texas. But he was a farmer in the area, and he loaned not really loaned, gave a trailer full of corn in order for them to survive because their crops had failed that winter. And they proceeded that next year to try to hang Father Leopold, literally tried to hang Father Leopold. And he escaped up to Detroit, died in Detroit, did some great things over there, established a seminary and school that still exists today. And in 1978, on the 100th anniversary of his death, they dug him up and reinterred him underneath that oak tree. So he couldn't even survive 100 years of being away from Santa Maria after they tried to hang him in 1855. Fortunately, the Opielas, my great-great-grandfather on my dad's side, came in 1856 after the drought was over with. My father's side of the family has had some great fortune with regard to droughts over the years. He had fought in Nicholas Opiela, Mikolash Opiela had fought in the Prussian army. Keep in mind, Poland didn't exist until after World War II, you remember. And so as part of Prussia, it was divided into three. You had Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which controlled Poland, okay? And so he had fought in the Prussian army and had about 200 acres and was able to survive the drought in 54, but decided to come in 1856 because the Prussian government had built a railroad through the middle of his property, and he got pissed off about it and said, to hell with you, I'm going to Texas with the rest of the people who had come from the community. And so he missed that drought. 100 years after that, my own father missed the drought of 1956, and because he got drafted into the Korean conflict, sold all his cattle at high prices that were there before the drought, and bought them back cheap after he got out of the army at the end of the Korean War, and was able to grow 200 acres to 2,300 acres that we have today. So it's kind of interesting how 100 years later, the same history that we had with droughts has changed. But like was said earlier, we ranch in Carnsby and Live Oak counties. And I'm really connected to my Polish identity, even though I don't speak as much Polish as I'd love to, right? I took it at UT. And to those of you who came a little late, I actually had to take it pass-fail because I was so bad at it. But nevertheless, you'll all know that Texas is bigger than Poland. Yeah, I wanted to at least put that out there. But we had people before the Polish immigrants that came to Santa Maria who came here to Texas as early as the late 1700s in small groups. And in fact, the soldier that found Santa Ana, Andrzej Felix Warszawski, was a Polish immigrant, okay? Y'all know the story of the Battle of San Jacinto? Probably some of you are not from Texas, so you might not have learned this in school. So in Texas, you learned this in junior high, the story of Santa Ana. Santa Ana was the dictator of Mexico. He was in charge of the Mexican army, and they had kicked the butts of the Texians through every single battle in the revolution, the Texas Revolution. You know, from the Alamo to Goliad, the massacre at Fannin, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, and then one day on April 22nd of 1836, General Santa Ana was found by Felix Warszawski sleeping, taking an afternoon siesta under a tree near San Jacinto, near Houston, and they captured him and held him hostage and elicited the surrender of the powerful Mexican army that caused Texas to finally win the Revolutionary War that we had with Mexico. And it's interesting, the Polish connection to that a lot of people really don't know. He was not part of he predated the Silesians that came to Santa Maria, but nevertheless played an important role in creating the Texas that was there for them to come to just 18 years later. So we also had a second wave of Polish immigrants that came to the Brazos Valley. So they came from Wielkopolska. They came from kind of the land just west of Warsaw, greater Poland. So they weren't Silesians, but they nevertheless came to Texas just 10 years later, a little bit 13 years later. And they settled in the Brazos Valley from Chapel Hill, New Waverly, all of those communities in there. And there was also, y'all know, the town of Rosenberg, Texas. Rosenberg, Texas was founded by a group of Polish Jews who came in the 1870s as well, or 1860s, and now is a thriving suburb of Houston. So then we had a new wave that came after the war. So we had the 100 people that came to Santa Maria. We had about 100 to 200 families that came to the Brazos Valley. We came before the Civil War, survived the Civil War. There's also a neat story too about how, the bulk of the immigrants that came in 1854 were peasants, right? They were used to, I don't want to call it slavery, but it is, the peasant life is one of servitude, indentured servitude to the landowners in feudal Central Europe, right? And so they sided with the Union during the war, and to much of their own peril, because the entire surrounding area were all supporting the Confederacy. And it got so bad during Reconstruction after the war that the Union Army, the United States Army, had to send an encampment from San Antonio to protect them from the rest of the people who were harassing them after the war, because they had supported the Union during the war. So you had then the group that came after the Civil War who didn't have to experience that. But in Santa Maria, what it did was it created an insular community. My father didn't learn English until he went to the public school in 3rd grade. In the first 2 years that he went to the parochial school in Santa Maria, the nuns taught him Polish. The entire community, even until right before World War II, was so very insular that it did not integrate with the rest of the county because of the experience during the after-war period, during the Reconstruction period. And how it's so changed after that point, we now have, when I was in school, the parochial school became the public school in Santa Maria. It was taught by the nuns were teaching in public school. And we had our first Polish county judge. My cousin was the first Polish sheriff of Karnes County. The county commissioners, everyone in political office now, except for Hispanic Texans in Karnes County, are Polish. So it's kind of interesting how the tables have turned in the last nearly 200 years. So we came from Silesia, and the bulk of the immigration came from the Prussian partition. However, there were small groups that came from the Austrian partition as well. And they settled they settled first in South Texas. And the other areas, other than the Brazos Valley, came in the 1930s as branch-offs from the original group in Santa Maria. So we had another drought. This is the story of agricultural people. When you have a drought, you lose everything, and you have to find somewhere else to go if you don't have anything saved, right? And so you had a huge group that went down to South Texas to McCook in Hidalgo County. They're still there today. And another group that went to White Deer in the Texas Panhandle right after the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. And then we have the next group that came, and here's just a list of all of the Polish communities, largely rural communities, that came originally from the group in Santa Maria. So we had the first breakaway from the group in Santa Maria was in Bandera. Bandera is just on the other side of San Antonio. And St. Stanislaus Church is the second Polish community in the United States. They went over there actually with Father Leopold as he was ministering to the people in Castroville. He said, there's some good land, because the land was bad in South Texas. There's some good land in the hill country that you can farm. And so he brought them to Bandera. Then there was a small group near Buda, that near San Marcos, that founded that community. Then St. Hedwig, which was originally called Martinez, on Martinez Creek in Bexar County, in eastern Bexar County. And then the Lemming community in Atascosa County. And then a whole group of breakaways. The problem with the Polish community is they can't get along with each other. We have kind of a running joke that when you enter Karnes County, should be a sign that says does not play well with others. And so they would constantly be breaking away in Czestochowa and Kosciuszko and the other small communities around, as they just couldn't live with each other. And then, of course, like I talked about, the groups that went up to White Deer and McCook. And of course, then we have the Polish communities in the Brazos Valley that founded or that were part of all of these communities that I just talked about earlier. So you can really see the big group that came in 1854, right? And then it really took off in the 1870s and the 1880s. It really took off coming into the United States, largely to Texas, and then later to places like Chicago, like to New York, and the area in Pennsylvania, which is better known for the Amish, but also has a huge Polish community. And even some of the original settlers here in Santa Maria ended up in all of those places as well and found Polish communities there. In fact, the first Polish legislator in the United States is Peter Kielbasa, who is originally from Santa Maria, but who fought on the Union side in the Civil War and ended up in Chicago and became the first Polish legislator when he was elected to the Illinois legislature in the 1870s. And so it's interesting how that connection still goes out. In fact, one of my, I guess a cousin of mine ended up in California as they just spread out across the United States. And then we had the third wave of Poles, which came after the war, after the two world wars, and largely as a response to the Solidarity movement and the repression of the second revolution that we had, revolution against communism, in the 1980s. And in fact, the pastor, so we had a series of priests in Santa Maria who came to the oldest Polish settlement after surviving interesting hardships back in Poland. In fact, when I was little, Father Bernard Goebel had survived Dachau, the concentration camp, had his tongue cut in half by the Nazis, and ended up at being the pastor of Santa Maria, Texas, for nearly 50 years after World War II. He was replaced by Father Frank Kujaj. And Father Frank, he's the pastor in Bandera now, but he came in 1983. He was a Solidarity priest who was basically kicked out of Poland. They said, you know, you're going to go to jail or you can just leave because we don't want you around organizing people against the communist government, against Jaruzelski's government. And then he brought a series of other Solidarity priests and other people to come out of that second wave, but they didn't come nearly all out of his group that came. A huge group came to Houston. And there's a huge Polish community in Houston, and Our Lady of Czestochowa parish there, that largely came after the fall of communism, or during the beginning of the fall of communism in the 1980s. And of course, like I said earlier, now people are coming from everywhere. You know, we have friends that immigrated from Canada, from, you know, just like what you've heard in the room here today, some of your parents and some of your grandparents. And so Texas is the magnet for people, not just in the 1850s when they suffered, but even now, finding a better opportunity here in Texas. And I'm proud to be a part of that. And of course, here's some pictures of what you're going to see when you go to Panna Maria, our Polish Heritage Center, which we're really excited about. If you are going to, you're probably celebrating Christmas with your families. But if you do celebrate Christmas, we have a Pasterka Mass, a Shepherd's Mass on Christmas Eve during the day, all in Polish. We have two masses a year in Polish, one on Good Friday and the other one on Christmas Eve, and all the rest are in English. You might be interested in coming to that if that's what you have time to do. We also were honored in 2019 to get a visit from the Polish president, who presented an award to Dr. Jim Mazurkiewicz. He's our president for Polish American Council of Texas. It's the umbrella group for all of the Polish heritage and cultural organizations that we have. We have a group in El Paso, a group up in Amarillo in the White Deer community. We have an Austin Polish Society here in Austin that are all, and then the university groups, both at A&M and UT, that are part of the Polish American Council of Texas. And we're having our annual meeting on the 13th of November in New Waverly, which is just north of Conroe, a little ways away. But if you're interested in going to that, there's going to be a meal and just social fun, I guess, is the best way to say it. But this is our 10th anniversary. We organized this group. It was started by, you saw on the video, Bishop John Yonta. He's the first Polish American bishop in the Roman Catholic Church. He's from Panna Maria originally. He was the bishop of the Amarillo Diocese up in the Panhandle of Texas. And he founded this group back in about a decade ago in his retirement. And he's been trying to promote Polish heritage and culture to keep that community alive, because there's been so much lost by my generation, right? We don't speak the language. They didn't grow up speaking the language like my father's generation did. And so there's a fear that a lot of this is going to be lost. And so I'm excited about that as well. I had some neat experiences as a kid growing up when, like I said earlier, when Pope John Paul came to visit our group, our community in 1987 as a little kid that I remember. Having Lech Wałęsa come, he was the president of Poland, right after it gained the end of the collapse of communism. He came when I was in high school and spoke to our community. So we've had some neat experiences that I've had that my children really don't have that connection to Poland for. So, and now we have a consulate general here in Texas. Robert Brzeski is the first Polish general counsel in Texas in Houston to serve the Polish community in Texas, and they've done a lot. The council's office has done a lot to, in fact, y'all should apply for funding this year. The Polish Senate provides funding for Polish groups, and PACT also helps in giving that money out. Y'all should apply to help this group here at UT. But the government of Poland is really doing a lot to try and build the diaspora in the United States and support the diaspora in the United States. So Dr. Jim Mazurkiewicz had helped prepare this presentation, and I want to give him credit for that. And now open for any questions you might have now that you know a little bit about the history of Poles in Texas since 1836 and all the way to Panna Maria to the present. And just really excited to come speak to the group. And thank you.
Really great presentation.
Thanks.
I'm just curious, how many people live in Panna Maria, and how big is the active Polish community there?
Yeah, so it has appeared to almost become a ghost town from time to time, right? We suffer like many rural communities in Texas from the brain drain, right? The kids go off to college and they never come back, okay? And so there's still about 100 to 150 families in the greater Santa Maria area. And so it's still a very small community. But we have thousands of people who have come from Santa Maria. We come back, we have in October of every year, a homecoming celebration, I guess is the best way to say it. It's a turkey dinner. It was earlier last month. And so we have, more than 1,000 people that come to that every year, but they don't live in Santa Maria itself. Santa Maria, as you drive into it, you're going to say, where is it all? It is just the church, the Polish Heritage Center, the museum, which was the old parochial school, the public school that was built right next to it in the 1960s, and just the parish hall and a few houses. And that's really all that's left in Santa Maria. It never became the big thriving cities that places like New Braunfels became, right? Never became even the Czechs are better at marketing than the Poles. They have Shiner beer and the Czech community in West Texas and others. The Poles have still maintained that very insular culture that has really hurt them in terms of economic growth and development. It doesn't help that it's really in the middle of nowhere. New Braunfels is on I-35. Fredericksburg is the heart of the hill country and so on. But you really have to be going to Santa Maria to go to Santa Maria, okay? It's the end of the road. You either get there from 123 in San Marcos or Highway 80 through Luling. And that's the only way that you can get to Santa Maria. You have to be headed there as a destination or you will miss it. So I wish it was bigger and better, but it's ours. So I know a number of you are taking, what classes are they offering in Polish heritage and culture here at UT? When I went to UT, we had 2 classes. One was Polish and the language class, and then we had a Polish heritage and culture class that was taught by John Kolsty, who wasn't Polish, by the way, but he taught the class anyway. What do y'all have now as an offering?
We have the Polish language courses, of course.
Yes.
And then I don't think there's any classes specifically about Poland, but there are like culture classes about Eastern European culture. And I know there's government classes about like Eastern European government.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything specifically about Poland though, besides the language course.
There's a scholarship program called the Normandy Scholars Program.
Yes.
And I believe that they have one of their classes is about Poland during World War II.
Okay.
Solely dedicated to that.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, Poland has always been the battle land of Europe, okay? It helps that it's a plain, fertile agricultural land. It happens to be a nice open place to fight wars for people over the last, 200 or more years. And so I'm glad that Normandy Scholars is offering that, because when I was at UT in the late 1990s. I went to Poland, but not through UT. So we had Father Frank actually, it was like a rock star in Poland. This guy has news cameras follow him whenever he brings groups every year from Santa Maria back to the communities where we came from. And I went in 98 then. And but he's actually kind of a controversial figure with the current Polish government, because there is have y'all heard of the Silesian separatist movement? Mm-hmm. So there is this kind of undercurrent of trying to create Silesia as its own country, separate and apart from Poland. And he's written a couple of books that have that the Polish government really doesn't want to promote Silesia becoming its own country, right? Because that's where all the good bit of the resources are, the coal, the farmland, and so on. But nevertheless, he's been really active at organizing people to go back. And I had the privilege of going back when I was at UT And to hear that Normandy Scholars is sending people, not just taking the classes, but potentially, because I know they go back to Europe every year. So I don't know what COVID's done to it. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. So how did y'all get started as a club? I know you started it, or give me the backstory here. Is it this year is the first full year, or was it last year?
We started last year, did a semester over Zoom.
Okay.
This is our first semester in person, but yeah.
Okay.
We were started to address, we wanted a Polish community on campus. One didn't exist. There was already kind of a potential there with the Polish classes and the students taking it. So yeah, and we wanted to promote our heritage and learn about Poland. Yeah.
Small, growing, I'm proud. That's good. So, well, good. But what else can I do for you guys?
Also, what is something that you would recommend that students could do to help sort of maintain this Polish cultural growth? Because the PACT, being the organization that it is, I know that it does some things for students, but I mean, like we saw in the videos, a lot of older individuals that are kind of maintaining the drive right now. What would you recommend students do to keep that sort of flame lit and do what they can?
So I know you visited, or did y'all all go to the A&M group in the last weekend or a couple of weekends ago?
About 4 of us in here did.
They have a pretty thriving group there. I mean, of course, they've been at it for about 5 years longer, okay? And there is, I think, a bigger Polish community at A&M because of where it is, right? A large group of people who grew up in the Brazos Valley are Polish themselves and ended up going to A&M. In fact, when I went to school, I was one of about 3 of us that went from my high school to UT. All the rest either went to A&M, or Texas State. So we were kind of the black sheep going to UT. Whereas A&M is kind of the small rural, you get it, A&M, right? So they have a bigger group to work from, but I would take some lessons from what they're doing. I know that they do a monthly group meal, or where they go from house to house and have a social hour where they cook food. Food's always a good thing in college. When I ran for student body vice president at UT, there were 2 things that bought votes here at UT. T-shirts is number 1, and number 2 is food. And so we would always get people excited about our campaign when we were giving out food. So food would be, I think, a neat way that you could cook Polish food. Take some meals, get some recipes from your grandma, and cook them. I think that might be a kind of a neat way to do it. And then I know that I'm trying to remember her name. There was a professor in the history department that was she was always trying to hit me up for money. I can't remember. I will look it up. She was trying to start a Polish studies program, and I don't think she was ever successful in doing this. This was right before COVID. I'll find it. You might reach out to her. Maybe she's not even here anymore. I shut down mail. But give me one moment. Let's see here. It would be now I can't move the. There we go. Give me one moment. I'm trying to remember her name. Oh gosh. Well, I'll look it up and I'll give it to you. How about that? That's all I can think of. Have social events, right? Don't just come and listen to UT graduates come and speak to you about Texas Polonia. Oh, I want to tell you about 2 websites that you'll want to go to. If you give me one moment. And of course, we have the Polish Heritage Center website, polishheritagecentertx.org. And that's now live now that the center has launched. And then Polish American Council of Texas is pactx.org. And you can learn about the Polish American Council of Texas. And then, if you give me 1 second, SilesianTexans.com. So this tells the story of all of the groups that came from Silesia, from Upper Silesia, started to Panna Maria in the 1800s, and it has a list of each of the towns and kind of where they settled, and then it has stories of every family that came. There was a group that put together, not every has, some of them have been filled out, but I'll use our family's story. And they have, the brand that they used for their cattle, and the story of how they, how the original family came to Texas. And so you can learn about each of the individual families. It's kind of neat. None of y'all are descendant from that, so I don't know what your interest might be, but it could be. It could be a way to kind of get in touch with the Silesian Texas experience. But those three websites, pactx.org, SilesianTexans.com, and Polish Heritage Center TX.org. Should be some neat websites to go to. Okay. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. And to the extent I can be more helpful to the organization, let me know. We just moved into a new house, so we're trying to get it organized, but maybe next year sometime we'll have landscaping done, and I can invite y'all to come for dinner. If y'all are going to do those meals, be happy to do that. And I'm excited that you guys are starting a club. Let's keep it up. Let's keep it up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before everybody leaves, can we all get a picture together?
Do you want to put the PowerPoint up in the back?
Yeah, that could be good.